let's move into the next category here then of bias, and this is instrument bias. And when we talk about instrument bias, we're talking about the survey questionnaire itself. So the instructions, the questions, the order, the scales, the responses, that kind of stuff. Now there is 12 things listed here. And what you'll see is that at the end of each one, it refers to pages which are later in this unit. So in the first one, it says Unstated Criteria, page D25, number 5, and D27, number 4. I've got a number of surveys that we will work through. There are actually examples of bad surveys, ones that need to be fixed up. And so we're going to go through them and fix them up. And so these are referring to the page number that you'll find them and the question number. Now, I'm not going to jump back and forth. That would be too difficult to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read the first one here, and then we're going to jump to page D25, number 5, and we're going to stay around those pages there. And then I've got a paper copy then of these 12 points here, so I'll just read them out, and then we'll jump to the next one and so on. So we're not jumping back and forth here. So the first one here is unstated criteria. This is criteria used in making a choice is not obvious. And so we're going to take a look then at page D25, number 5 for that one. That's the first one right here, page D25, number 5. How satisfied are you with the quality of service provided by the library and the attitude of the library staff? Now, there's lots of problems with this particular one. Ambiguous questions, it's a double barrel question, which we'll get to later. But it also doesn't give you any criteria in terms of, well, what are the choices? So typically with a question like this, we would give it a 5-point Likert scale and say very dissatisfied, dissatisfied, neutral, satisfied, and very satisfied. So you're asking them to circle one of those numbers. And again, there's further problems with this particular one here. Page 27, number 4 is the other one here. And so what kind of soup did you have for lunch today? And so there's no criteria here in terms of how to focus them in on something. What we'll see is the word kind itself is very ambiguous, so you'd want to give them some choices. What are the different ways that they can answer that? It's hot soup, it's cold soup, it's prepared soup, it's packaged soup, homemade soup, canned soup, box soup, it's Campbell soup, it's Lipton soup, it's chicken noodle soup, it is tomato-based soup, there's lots of different ways that you can actually answer this one, so you want to give them some categories here. All right, number 2 is inapplicable questions, questions that do not apply to everyone. So let's take a look at page 25, number 6, and that is, what do you dislike about the library? Now, that isn't necessarily a bad question, but you want to first ask the question, is there anything that you dislike about the library? And maybe word that a little differently and so on. And if yes, then you jump to that particular question. But just having it like this assumes that everybody has something that they dislike about the library. Okay? So that is something where it's inapplicable to a lot of people here. You should have a branching question first. 27, number 4 says, well, this is one we just looked at. What kind of soup did you have for lunch today? I didn't have lunch, or I didn't have soup for lunch. And so how do I answer that? And again, you want to have something that branches to that. An earlier question that says, did you have soup for lunch today? Yes or no? And then if yes, what kind of soup? And if no, why not? And that kind of stuff. Okay. Number 3 is over-demanding recall. And we're going to take a look at 24. This is the BADM personal 111 personal data survey. And it says number 9 and number 10. How would you rate last year's TV shows? Now, this actually, these are also the ones that I have for the next one, which is overgeneralizations. So let's take a look at those first. Number 9 and number 10, overgeneralizations. How would you rate last year's TV shows? How would you rate last year's movies? Those are very general. You're not going to get anything really useful out of that. So when you're talking about TV shows, you'd want to narrow it down to specific categories. Maybe they're the news ones. Maybe they're from a particular station or something. Maybe they're Netflix movies or Netflix series, drama series, or maybe they're comedy series or something like that. And so you want to narrow it down so it's not just a big overgeneralization on that. So that's overgeneralization. Over-demanding recall is where we kind of started with this one. And that is a whole year's worth. That's a lot to remember on that. And so that's really difficult. What you want to do is you want to narrow it down to a smaller time period in the last month or the last week or something like that. Similarly then with, let's see what I got here. 25, number 2. How many books or publications have you borrowed from the library? Now notice it doesn't have a time period here. And so what are we saying? Ever? That's over-demanding recall for sure. Even the last year, well, it depends who you talk to. For some people, that's going to be close to 0, or maybe it is 0 if you never borrow books from the library. But still, if you occasionally go to the library, that would be difficult to answer. If you're my friend Jason Engel, that would be really difficult to answer because he tends to hit the library about every 3 weeks. And he'll usually have a stack of anywhere from 4 to 30 books. And that's because he and his son tend to be voracious readers. And so they're always using the public library. And so that would be real over-demanding recall for them. Okay. Over-demanding recall, overgeneralizations, over-specificity. I don't have a great example of this from these particular questionnaires here, but if I ask something like, what is your height to the nearest tenth of a centimeter? Well, that's ridiculous. That's a level of precision which you really don't need, as well as it's very difficult to measure to the nearest tenth of a centimeter, right? If you take a deep breath and then let it out, you're going to change your height. Similarly, if you're talking about your weight to the nearest, hundredth of a kilogram, the same kind of thing too is if you go to the bathroom, then it's going to change by several hundredths. So you probably don't need that level there of specificity. Overemphasis, wording is over emphatic. And again, not a great example in here, but if I asked something like, do you approve of this ridiculous proposal? And so by putting in that adjective ridiculous, I've biased you in a particular direction here. All right. Number 7, ambiguous words. A large number of examples here of ambiguous words. Let me just give you 1 or 2 of them. Page 27 here. This particular one has lots of ambiguous terms in here. Number 4, we've seen this one before. What kind of soup? So the word kind of soup, is very ambiguous. What do we mean by that? Number 6, did you have anything else with it? And what do we mean by that? Are we talking about something that we ate, something that we drank? Could it mean, could I put down that I read the newspaper with it, or that I talked to a friend on that? So what do we mean by that? That's an ambiguous term. Number 8 is a double barrel question. We've actually seen this one before. It's 25, number 5, and that is, how satisfied are you with the quality of service provided by the library and the attitude of the library staff? So that's actually 2 different questions there. A double-barreled question, we call that. You want to break that into 2 questions. Number 9 is leading questions. They lead the respondent to a particular answer. An example of that would be page 26, number 8. Do you approve or disapprove of the recent proposals made by the Library Management Review Committee, such as the proposal to double fines for overdue books? Now, the problem with that is that you're using a very negative example here. It says here recent proposals, which is plural, so I assume here that there's a number of different proposals, and so you need to either list each one or select ones here and ask about each one. But you don't want to ask about all of them together and then give one negative example there. That's will lead in a particular direction here. Number 10 says a loaded question, and that is just up, let's see, 25, number 6 here. What do you dislike about the library? And so we saw that before as an example that may not apply to everybody here, but this is a loaded question in that it's a subtle form of influence. It's assuming that there is something wrong with the library, planting that in your mind, and expecting that you have an answer for that. Number 11 says incomplete and or poor instructions. Well, every one of these surveys that we have here is missing an introduction. That's a big thing here. So all 3 of these, no introduction, no introduction, no introduction, no conclusion other than a thank you in this particular case here. And then what we'll often have is, in some surveys here, is it divided up into different areas or sections. And so, for instance, at the very end of a questionnaire, you might say, these last few questions are used for classification purposes only. And so they're the demographic questions. What is your age? What is your gender? What is your level of education? And so on like that. So having those instructions in there. Or instructions about how to fill out a particular question. Check all that apply. Check one only. Rank the top 3. So you want to make sure that you include those kinds of instructions there. And then finally we've got number 12, which is confusing skip patterns. So we've got 26, number 8, which is up here. Do you approve or disapprove of the recent proposals made by the Library Management Review Committee, such as the proposal to double fines for overdue library books? If you disapprove, go to question 11. And question 11 has nothing to do with it. It should have been skipped to question number 10, or branched to question number 10. You might look at that and say, well, that was a dumb error. The problem is that that's a very common error, and one that I've done many times. And here's why. Because you go through several iterations in making your questionnaire better. And so what probably happened was that there was an earlier question here that you took out. So originally question 8 was actually question 9, and so it did actually branch to question 11, which is the correct one. But then you took out, say, question 4, whatever, and everything moved up one, and so you're no longer skipping to question 11, you're skipping to question 10. It's an easy mistake to make. So make sure that you go through and see that all of your branches and skips and so on like that make sense. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that point, and then we are going to pick up response bias in the next section. Thanks for listening.